Okay. So first of all, good evening, everybody. Nice to see everybody. Um, so I was trying to think of a topic for tonight, and obviously the big news in the Jewish world is still everything that's going on in Israel. But first of all, first of all, I know that not everybody follows the news from Israel as, assiduously as I do. I think there's for some people there's maybe a little bit of Israel overload, and it's a moving target. I mean, if I had prepared my notes for my talk this morning, they would already be obsolete. I mean, so many things happened in Israel today. So, but then I was saying, so I read this article by Art Green, and I said, well, I don't know, is rabbinic training that much of interest? I mean, obviously it's of interest to rabbis, and it's, I know Art Green, I know Brad Artson, who wrote the response, but but I thought, as it reflects on larger questions, it's worth looking at. And my hope, as always, is that this will be really a dialogue and a discussion and not just a monologue. But that depends more on you all than it does on me. So let me, and I sent out the links, but I don't assume that everybody actually read them. So let me just kind of give a little bit of background and summarize to some extent Art Green's article. So who is Art Green? He was ordained at JTS in the mid 1960s. I'm not sure exactly what date, but he just turned 80. So, you can do more or less do the math. But he never was a pulpit rabbi. And from JTS, he went to Brandeis to do his PhD. He is really a recognized scholar in Hasidism. His PhD dissertation became a book that a lot of people, I've seen it on a lot of people's shelves. The book is called Tormented Master. It's a biography of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav. Some of you may even have it on your shelves. And he was, after he got so while he was at Brandeis, he was the founder of Havarat Shalom. Havarat Shalom is sort of the granddaddy of the Havarah movement, and it's one of the few Havarot from the 1960s that still exists. Now, interestingly enough, and it was founded, the original name of Havarat Shalom, which is in Somerville, Massachusetts, so just outside of Boston, was Havarat Shalom Community Seminary. Okay, and why was it called Havarat Shalom Community Seminary? Because this was during the Vietnam War. And one way to gain a draft exemption during the Vietnam War was to be a seminary student. So Havarat Shalom was founded originally as a seminary, and if you were a member of Havarat Shalom, you could get a draft deferment. It eventually became, anyway, it's an interesting thing. If you have a copy of the Jewish Catalog, which is that red book that a lot of people had, that grew out of Havarat Shalom as well. And then he taught at the University of Pennsylvania until 1984. So if I tell you he taught at the University of Pennsylvania, that gives you, some sense of his status as a scholar. And in 1984, he was appointed as the president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, which is also in Philadelphia. And he headed RRC for, a while. I'm not sure, probably around 10 years or so. And in 2003, he was appointed as the first dean of the rabbinical program at Hebrew College in Boston. Hebrew College is not to be confused with Hebrew Union College. Hebrew College, it was basically a Hebrew teachers college. I mean, just like Baltimore Hebrew College and some of the others. But Hebrew College started a rabbinical program, which is non-denominational, and meaning that you are not training to be a Reform rabbi or a conservative rabbi or a Reconstructionist rabbi. You're just training to be a rabbi. Now, in theory, possibly Orthodox as well, but I mean, the Orthodox world is very different. Orthodox rabbinic training is very different. And I would say, having, met over the years some of the graduates of the Hebrew College Rabbinical Program, it's a good program. I mean, there are certainly programs that are not good programs and whose graduates, I would say, are not really well trained. But Hebrew College, I think, is a good program, and it is increasingly like, if you and one of the marks of being sort of a respectable program is, on the basis of that ordination, can you join the major rabbinical organization? Like, can you become a member of the Rabbinical Assembly, which is the Association of Conservative Rabbis? And it's not automatic, but if you are a graduate of Hebrew College and you're working in a conservative institution, and you go through the process, you can become a member of the Rabbinical Assembly with that ordination. So Art Green is known as both a scholar of Hasidism and as well as a theologian. He's tried to create a sort of neo-Hasidic theology that's not orthodox but serious. A few years ago, he spoke at our shul, what's now known as the Haberman Institute. I think at that time it was still known as the Foundation for Jewish Studies. Had a day-long study day with him. It was held at our shul, and so some of you may have heard him when he spoke there. And he's a very, very, serious scholar, well respected, certainly across, let's say, the non-Orthodox world. And he wrote, I sent out this link to this article that he wrote. The headline is, "Are Rabbis Giving Into Assimilation?" I'm not sure that the headline really reflects the content of the article, but he spoke very critically of two different things that have happened fairly recently in rabbinic training. One is the decision of Hebrew College, of which he was the founding dean, and from which he hadn't been the dean for some time, but he was still a member of the faculty and, dean emeritus or whatever. Was the decision that Hebrew College made fairly recently to change their policy. I mean, they had a policy like most rabbinical schools that, if you are married to or dating a non-Jew, you're not eligible for admission. And if you are admitted and then start dating or marry a non-Jew, you won't be ordained. And they got rid of that policy. Also, fairly recently, the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, which is the conservative seminary in LA, and full disclosure, I was a member of the faculty there just for a year. I wasn't real happy there, but they announced that they were revamping their program, and what had been a 5-year program, they are now saying it's a 4-year program, but it's really a 3-year program plus a year of an internship. So, in residence, full-time academic study has gone from 5 years to 3 years. Green talks, and he says that, both of these programs were driven by similar factors. One is the small applicant pool. And it was interesting that he said that about Hebrew College, because the denominational seminaries have really shrunk. I know I spoke about this last year or maybe earlier this year, but HUC, which is the Reform Seminary, announced fairly recently that they were closing their Cincinnati campus. And their enrollment has plummeted. The enrollment at JTS has plummeted. They were ordaining, 15, 20 rabbis a year. Now they're ordaining, 6 or 7 a year. So enrollment has plummeted. And at Ziegler, it's also plummeted. But even at Hebrew College, which has been a growing program, and anecdotally, I know that, a lot of people are attracted to Hebrew College as opposed to the denominational seminaries, for a couple of reasons. One is that, and I agree with this, I was 20 years old when I was admitted to HUC, which is a Reform seminary, and I came out at age 26 wanting to be a conservative rabbi. When you're when you're fresh out of college, you're not fully baked, right? I think in American society, you're not really fully baked until you're in your mid-30s at this point. So that, the opportunity to go to school without, committing to one denomination or another until you're, closer to finished with the school. I think that there is some level on which that makes sense. Also, Hebrew College has a reputation as being a very warm and nurturing community, which the other rabbinical schools are very much not. I liked the classroom experience at HUC. Pretty much everything else about HUC I hated. And I think that that's true of lots and lots of rabbis, that they liked, their classes, but not much else. But there's also, financial pressures. And here Green makes an interesting point, is that, donors prefer, like the big money donors prefer to give their money to endow chairs in Jewish studies at universities rather than to support rabbinic education because it's seen as more prestigious. And Green makes the point that, these donors think that they are contributing to the Jewish future and Jewish continuity by endowing shares in Jewish studies, but Jewish studies professors have made it very clear that nurturing Jewish identity is not their job. And it's really not their job. I mean, and I've had this conversation with people over and over. I mean, a professor of Jewish studies is an academic, right? It is not an academic's job to nurture the spiritual life of their students. A professor of Jewish studies doesn't need to be Jewish. I mean, a professor of marine biology doesn't need to be a dolphin, right? I mean, you can be an expert in a subject matter without being part of that group. And frankly, I wish that, hyper wealthy donors got that, but they don't. So that, that the rabbinical schools are having trouble raising money. And finally, he says student demands, right? And we are in an era, and I think again, he's right, that students feel like, well, we're the consumers. We have the right to be satisfied and to be pleased and make whatever demands we want. And schools feel that they have, no choice but to accede to those demands. All right, so that's kind of his broad picture, of the overall sort of setting for both decisions. So let me pause here and see if there are any questions or comments so far. Okay, so we'll go on. Now, the question of, I want to look, separately at the Hebrew College thing and the Ziegler thing. Okay, so, the question of intermarried rabbis, right? And I want to acknowledge that any discussion of issues surrounding intermarriage is going to be sensitive, right? Because we have, all of us have friends, relatives, loved ones, maybe even ourselves who are intermarried. And even as somebody who is not intermarried, but, Kelly being a convert, right? So some of those same issues of extended non-Jewish family, exist for me, even though, my wife is Jewish. So, and it's hard to talk about some of this stuff without being perceived as judgmental, right? Which violates the 11th commandment of American life: thou shalt not be judgmental. So the question of intermarried rabbis, so I have to say, so Aleph, which is the rabbinic training program of the Jewish renewal movement, and I don't want to get into even what that is. You can ask me later, but the Jewish renewal movement has its own rabbinic training program. It's not a brick and mortar seminary. It's a mostly distance learning program, but I know people who have gone through the program. And again, I think it's a serious program. Anyway, they never had a policy excluding intermarried rabbinical candidates. And a few years ago, when I organized my trip to Nogales, one of the people who contacted me to go on the trip, and eventually he did go on the trip, the fellow by the name of Ed Staffman, who was an Aleph ordained rabbi. And I have to say, when I first was contacted, I was like, I'm not sure, because his wife is not Jewish. But Ed is an interesting guy. Like many of the people who went to the Aleph program, he's a second career rabbi. He was an attorney who specialized in federal death penalty appeals. He also worked on Al Gore's legal team in the litigation around the 2000 election. And he was married to a non-Jewish woman, and later on in life, he had kind of a spiritual awakening, spiritual renewal, decided to give up practicing law, become a rabbi, got ordained by the Aleph program, took a reform pulpit in Bozeman, Montana, did that for 10 years and then retired. And now he is, interestingly enough, the only Jewish member of the Montana state legislature. After he retired from the rabbinate, he ran for the legislature. And he's an interesting guy. And he was, especially being a lawyer, made a real contribution to our group. Okay, so anyway, these are all anecdotal. RRC, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, changed its policy several years ago so that interfaith relationships would no longer be a barrier to admission or ordination. And HUC, Green writes, I don't know if he's correct or not, but he says now that RRC and Hebrew College have changed their policy, the pressure on HUC to change its policy will become, impossible to resist. I don't know if he's right. I'm not sure I really care. But what are arguments pro and con about intermarried rabbis? Okay, so the arguments in favor are that, if we look at it's hard to know how accurate such statistics are, right? But the best statistics we have is that 70% plus of non-Orthodox Jews who are getting married today are marrying non-Jews. Okay, so, more than 2 out of every 3 young Jews who marry is marrying somebody who's not Jewish. Okay, so first of all, if you don't accept intermarried or interpartnered people for rabbinical school, that knocks out 2/3 of your potential candidates, right? And we've already been talking about how, the great rabbi shortage and how few students there are in the rabbinical school. So, maybe it's not the greatest idea to a priori knock out more than 2/3 of your potential candidates, right? And similarly, maybe people are better served by rabbis who are more like them. I said something similar in my drasha this past Shabbat about, trying to level the distinction between rabbis and congregants. I'm not sure I would go as far as that. But the idea that maybe, Jews who are intermarried, which is the majority of young Jews, can be better served by rabbis who are intermarried because they understand the specific situations. All right. So that's one argument. Another is, every congregation says we are warm and welcoming, But, how warm and welcoming are we if we exclude intermarried Jews from being able to even apply to rabbinical school? And then as the pragmatic argument, right, is that, we just, we are reducing the pool of applicants by excluding intermarried Jews. Okay. The arguments on the other side is, a rabbi should be a role model. Is an intermarried Jew a role model? That Judaism is not just about the individual, it's about the family. And, the third argument is that, and most rabbis would agree with the following statement, that, in a relationship between a Jew and a non-Jew, the optimal outcome is for the non-Jewish partner to convert, right? And I would say many intermarried Jews would agree with that, even if their partner has not converted, that, an optimal outcome is for the non-Jewish partner to convert. And the argument is, well, how can you expect my partner to convert when the rabbi's partner hasn't converted, right? So those are some of the arguments, one way or the other. So again, let me pause here and ask for comments or questions. Yeah, Sue, you just jump right in.
Oh, I have a little laryngitis. I'll apologize for it. I read what you sent out, and I was so upset. I wasn't sure that my blood pressure medicine would carry me through. I'm like upset with the whole thing. I understand where you're coming from, or the article about intermarried rabbis, a larger pool of people and being just like the general Jewish population. But then I wonder, is there any information about the spouse needing to take at least a minimal informational class on Judaism? How about observances? Suppose the shul goes for Hanukkah at the rabbi's house, and it's right before Christmas, and there is a big tree and decorations outside, and this is the rabbi's house. I don't know. I mean, those kind of things I find very troubling. I also found it troubling. I think you had mentioned that one of the colleges did away with the time abroad in Israel. And since I feel like Israel is an integral part, whether we agree with the politics or not, eliminating that from the curriculum is, here we are giving free trips to Israel for kids, and then the college for rabbis is eliminating it. And some people have never been to Israel that are going to be trained as a rabbi. I find a lot of things that seem very acceptable in some of the very reformed areas of Judaism are, playing right into assimilation. And, I'm really troubled about it, to be honest with you.
Okay, so I just want to say one thing. I mean, if I send out an article and I say this is worth reading, don't, infer from that either that I agree or disagree. I mean, it's not, I had a discussion with another congregant about something else, and and some of you have heard me say this. It is not my job to merely say things that I think you will agree with, right? If I did that, then let's just hand out mirrors. right? And everybody can speak into the mirror and be assured that they will never have to hear something that they disagree with, right? I mean, if my job is to prod you to think. Okay, if you want to, send a quart bottle of hemlock to my house as a result, you know, go ahead, right? But the fact, so the fact that, look, I apologize if this has had a negative impact on your blood pressure, but the fact that you got so upset, I consider to be a good thing, right? Because A, you actually read it, and B, it got a response, okay? And I will tell you that I agree with much of what you said, but not necessarily all of it, okay? So, don't make any assumptions about where I stand just because I sent out an order, right? Anybody else?
Well, I was surprised. I read the articles also. I was surprised with the numbers of when it said, roughly 75% of non-Orthodox are intermarriage. And yet there was another thing that said that a large percentage of those families raise their children as Jews. But what kind of Judaism are they getting? Because I see there seems to be less and less of a connection as each subsequent generation goes. And then the other thing too that I found with adjusting the curriculum, I happen to like to look at original articles where I could, the original sources. And when they talk about with the Talmud, the Aramaic, and some they're looking at more modern things, I find that more disturbing.
Right.
Because this is so important to our heritage. No, I don't know Hebrew that well, and I don't know, obviously no Aramaic, but just even looking at things in English where you really need to look at the early documents and see how they progress, and learning something from your Talmud class too as a result with that. But I just worry about so many things are being, I don't want to say dumbed down, but watered down or changed. We have to, things do change. Things have to move with, as well, have to keep up with modernity, whatever you say, keeping up with the times. But how much are you going to push aside and say that's not that important?
Right. So look, I mean, Jewish demography is very, very hard. All right, because everything is self-reported, right? And first of all, second of all, it depends on whether the sampling methodology is really accurate or not, right? I mean, having said that, I don't find the statistics to the percentage of young Jews who intermarry. I don't find that surprising. I think it is probably close to accurate. What is interesting and what is hopeful on the one hand is that the clear majority of intermarried families sampled do report that they are raising their children as Jews. Okay. But you're correct to ask what exactly does that mean, right? Because we also know that less than half of all Jewish kids in the greater Washington area, forget intermarried, not intermarried, all Jewish kids, less than half are getting any sort of formal Jewish education at all, right? So the parents may say we are raising their kids as Jews, but we don't know what that means. It could mean all the way from, going to day school. I mean, anecdotally, we do know that there are, kids with intermarried parents going to day school, right? To being told you are Jewish, you know, here's a hamantash, right? I mean, and everything in between. So we don't really know what any of this means, right? So look, my own feeling, look, I mean, I can't imagine that the rabbinical assembly would ever admit an intermarried rabbi as a conservative rabbi, right? It's hard to imagine that you could be a conservative rabbi married to a non-Jew. Okay. Um, you know, but I would say short of being a rabbi or a cantor, right? I mean, we have intermarried Jews in positions of leadership, both ritual and governance, and they do a great job. And I am fine with that, even though until very recently, you know, the RA said that not, Jews married to non-Jews should be excluded from both ritual and governance leadership, right? And if you had asked me 20 years ago, I probably would have said I agree with that. I don't agree with that now. And it's not simply, because I'm not saying that just because Gail is here. I mean, I'm saying that because I believe it, but the thing is that the conservative movement doesn't live in isolation from the other movements of Judaism, right? And that's the problem. I mean, I pretty much no longer agree to serve on a Beit Din for a conversion with rabbis who are not conservative, because I can't trust their standards. I mean, unless it's somebody who I really know well. Whereas previously that was not my practice. I would, right? Because there's a certain inconsistency in us saying to reform rabbis, you really should bring your candidates to the mikvah and a Beit Din and so on and so forth, and then not be willing to sit on the Beit Din, right? But I won't do it anymore because I don't know, I don't trust their standard. Having said that, okay, so and this is a story, okay, when I was the Hillel director at American University, there was a senior very active in Hillel who I thought would make a great rabbi, who was involved, seriously dating, and had been for at least 3 years, maybe longer, 4 years actually, through all of college, dating a non-Jewish woman. Okay. Ironically, they had met at Hillel, okay, because her freshman roommate was Jewish, brought her to Hillel, they met, started dating, right? And I took him out to lunch, and I asked him, I said, what are you doing next year? He said, I've applied to several law schools. And I said, I don't think you should go to law school. I think you should apply to JTS. And he said, I can't apply to JTS. I'm dating Eve. And I said, yeah, I know. Okay, so you don't have to tell them, and I don't have to tell them. Okay, just apply. Okay, and he did apply. And they didn't ask him about if he was dating anybody. He didn't volunteer the information. By the time, a little bit later, she came to me and said, I want to start studying for conversion. Okay, she did start studying for conversion. He was accepted to JTS. They both moved to New York, not living together because JTS students are not allowed to live with, their their boyfriend or girlfriend anyway, but they both moved to New. She continued her studies for conversion, and he sort of kept her under wraps. Sometime later, she gave me a call and she said, "We're breaking up." She said, "I want to be Jewish. I do. I want to be Jewish, but I don't want to be so Jewish as I would expect it to be as the wife of a conservative rabbi." And they broke up. Okay. And he is today a very, very, very successful rabbi. He's an officer of the RA. He'll probably be the president of the RA at some point. And, did I do the right thing by encouraging him to apply to JTS, even though he had a very serious non-Jewish girlfriend? And did I do the right thing by not volunteering that information and telling him to not volunteer that information? I think I did, right? But, I mean, and I don't know whether many, that's why I know I haven't told you his name, right? I don't know how many people know this story, right? But, and had they stayed together, I would have been happy at that too. I mean, I thought she was, a great person, but, so the world is more complicated than simplistic regulations can sometimes reflect, so I mean, show me, did I do the right thing? Who says no? Who says yes? Okay. All right. So now let's go on to the Ziegler thing. All right. And I hope, by the way, that you read not only Art Green's article, but also Brad Artson's response, just out of fairness. Okay. So Brad says, they're still going to learn to read the text in the original. Okay. Face. I mean, the fact of the matter is, I mean, there are a lot of rabbis out there who can't really handle Hebrew text all that well, or Aramaic text all the more so. The one thing that he said that I found really interesting is that, we are moving from an academic model to a professional school model, right? That, and that again, we're doing this, and I understand the rationale, even though I don't agree with what they're doing. Okay, let me put all my cards on the table. The rationale is, look, a lot of rabbinic students are older. Okay, they're married, they have kids. Okay, rabbinical school tuition is fairly high, but it's not as high as a law school, but it's still, fairly expensive. But even if you're getting significant financial aid, right? If you're going to school full time for 5 years, you're not earning for 5 years. Right. And it's really hard, especially if you have kids, right, to not earn for 5 years and to uproot them. If you happen to already be living in Los Angeles or New York, great. But there are a lot of Jews who don't live in Los Angeles or New York, right? And to uproot them, and then to also uproot them to Jerusalem for a year, it is a disincentive to go to rabbinical school. And it really is. And certainly, look, I mean, law school is 3 years. It's not 5 years, right? And, on the other hand, law school, you're studying sources in English. You're not studying sources in Hebrew and Aramaic, right? So, um, I think personally, I mean, I would be less disturbed because they're saying we're cutting it from 5 years to 4, but they're really cutting it from 5 years to 3. And then the fourth year internship. And look, internships are valuable, but there is a difference between I don't know. I am worried that the education that Ziegler provides will be inadequate. Um, the argument about Israel that they make, I mean, there is a certain level of truth to the argument that they make, which is to say that, we schlep our students to Jerusalem for a year, but they're still going to school with other Americans and living in an English speaking ghetto of sorts, and they're not really exposed to Israel. The thing is that, for the most part, I mean, it is true that my year in Israel, I studied with other Americans in English. Most of what we did in Jerusalem, we could have done in Cincinnati or New York or LA. Um, but I rented an apartment from an Israeli landlord, right? I did my grocery shopping in an Israeli supermarket, right? I took the Egged bus to school and back every day. So that even if you are learning in a ghettoized situation, you're still experiencing Israeli society in other ways. And if they're talking about, an intensive 2 month thing in Israel, I can't imagine they're telling students to go out and rent apartments for 2 months, right? So that means that they're living in, a dorm of sorts. And I do think, personally, I think that that is inadequate. I mean, I understand, the flip side is that 5 years and a year in Israel and so on and so forth is difficult for people, and it is a disincentive. But on balance, I am not happy about this decision that Ziegler made. It's interesting. I mean, the argument that we're not training scholars, we're training people to follow a profession, right? And there's a difference between training to be a lawyer versus training to be a law professor, right? Um, and to a certain extent, 5 years is a long time. I mean, you could do a PhD in 5 years. Um, and it is also true that much of what I learned in rabbinical school, I don't use in my day-to-day work. On the other hand, I mean, I think somebody who has, somebody who comes to you after 3 years instead of 5 years, with all due respect, I don't think they're going to be able to teach at the level that I teach, right? I mean, whether me being able to teach at the level that I'm able to teach is actually of any use to you is not for me to say. Or the drashot that I give at the level that I give them. Whether that's of any use to you is, again, not for me to say, right? And the fact of the matter is that there are people floating around, with essentially mail order smicha, who congregations hire because they don't have to pay them as much. And probably 90% of what they do okay. So, the question of what level of education is really required to function as a pulpit rabbi, it's an open question, right? But I do think, and Sue, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, that the reduction of time spent in Israel, I think, is deeply problematic. Um, and personally, I think the reduction in the overall, curriculum is deeply problematic. Okay, so again, let me stop here for a minute. Questions or comments? All right, so let me just go on. Okay, so let me read to you Green's final paragraph, although I'm gathering that most of you have actually read his article, which is great. I appreciate it. It says, from a historical perspective, each of these decisions will be seen as a further surrendering to the process of assimilation, another reducing of the standards of Jewish difference from the general American population. As an ethno-religious minority living in a melting pot society, Jews have done remarkably well in maintaining their identity. Once distinctive, mostly white-skinned communities, race defines everything in the United States, have looked upon us with envy. But bit by bit, the erosion in the non-Orthodox majority increases. It is worth noticing it as it happens as a first step to asking whether and how it can be reversed. Okay, the problem that I have with what Art Green says is that the question is, what's the cart and what's the horse, right? I mean, in other words, right, if you ask many Orthodox rabbis, right, they will say Reform and conservative Judaism cause assimilation, right? I would say Reform and conservative Judaism are a response to assimilation, right? And they would say, no, if Reform and conservative didn't exist, everybody would be Orthodox. And I say, no, if Reform and conservative didn't exist, most Jews would be secular, right? So there is no doubt that these decisions are driven by processes which I think are not helpful to Jewish survival. Right? Having said that, I'm not sure what the alternative is, right? In other words, if I am heading a search committee, right, and my choice is between a well-trained rabbi and an inadequately trained rabbi, I want the well-trained rabbi, right? If the choice is between a well-trained rabbi or no rabbi, an inadequately trained rabbi is probably better than no rabbi. Although not always, because sometimes a rabbi can do more harm than good, right? So, I mean, Art points to a problem. He doesn't really offer a solution, right? And I am not sure. In other words, are RRC, are Hebrew College and Ziegler giving into student demands? Absolutely, right? The question is, if they did not give into student demands, what would be the result? Would the result be simply fewer rabbis? I think perhaps so. So I'm not sure. I mean, I think Art and I both have the same good ability to diagnose problems, and less successful in proposing effective solutions to the problems. And that, I think, is kind of frustrating. But so Sue, in answer to your cri de coeur, really, I agree with you. I mean, a lot of what I agreed with a lot of what Art said, and what he, what is going on makes me unhappy. But I'm not sure what the alternatives really are. And that's the problem. So again, let me stop here, and please, I mean, I would love to know what you all think about some of this stuff.
Well, it's a puzzle. It's a very difficult problem. And in a way, there's no easy answers to this. You can't, yes, you have to adjust to how things change. And the big question is, when students start demanding, you see an erosion of education sometimes. And sometimes, they push in a direction you might not have thought of that might be helpful. But I just see there's a sense in almost like a dumbing down of everything, and it becomes on the surface. And even in seeing families where there is a connection, the kids reach a certain age, young adulthood, late teens, and they pull away.
Right. I mean, the thing is that, and this is at every level. I mean, I grew up Reform, right? And when I was in Hebrew school, right, we went 2 afternoons a week plus Sunday, right? And now Reform Hebrew schools are mostly Sunday only, and conservative Hebrew schools are either Sunday only or Sunday and 1 weekday. All right. And this is because of parental demand, right? And so your alternatives are what? Be responsive to parental demand, or stick to your standards and have a very high quality program with many hours of education and no students.
That's right.
Right. So, this is not a Jewish issue. It is an American cultural issue, right? Where, the customer is king or queen, and you resist customer demands at your peril. All right. Anybody else? All right. If not, then thank you for attending. Lila Tov, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you
Shabbat
for,
shalom. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
thank you for
Thank you.
sharing your
Lila
thoughts.
Tov, I'll say Shabbat Shalom tomorrow.
Okay. Well, you can say it on Thursday too, All right. See ya.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Take care.